Welcome to the XY Advisor Podcast, a global community of financial advisors sharing and learning with one another to drive the positive evolution of financial advice. To get involved, go to xyadvisor.com or simply download the XY Advisor app.
Accelerating innovation and globalisation trends are disrupting global markets. We are a new generation asset management team that looks beyond traditional public markets to understand how innovation and disruption can benefit everyone. We are uniquely structured to solve the underweight to accelerating global innovation as we transition from Web 2.0 into Web 3.0. Our competitive advantage lies in the integration of our deep asset management and technology expertise under one aligned group to capitalise on the exponential opportunities of Web 3.0. The opportunities are for everyone. Invest different with Holon.
Hello, my name's Andrew Rox, aka Roxy, and it is another pleasure to be here as the host of the XY podcast. Today I'm interviewing someone who I know very well. His name is Tim Farr, and he's the Chief Operating Officer of Virtual Business Partners. Strap yourself in. There's very few businesses of this scale, and he's going to be able to have some unique insights into what goes into making a successful scale business. And with no further ado, good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Rox. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's all right. And it is your first time on the podcast. So,
it is, but not the first time you and I have spoken by a long shot.
No, it isn't. It isn't. and just as a letter of introduction, Tim and I share a couple of things. One is that we've both started as clients of Virtual Business Partners, and we're now both involved in Virtual Business Partners. But Tim will be the star of today's show, no doubt. Now, Tim, before we get into that, before you were the Chief Operating Officer, you were a financial planner, like many people listening here. And I always like to get a feel for how did you get there? You know, what was your story and what brought you into financial planning?
Yeah, I guess we're all affected or influenced by our parents and what we see them do in their careers. In my case, I had a couple of generations of accountants in my background, and so I generally led towards finance. I felt that I had a liking for commas and numbers and those sorts of things, which I did validate later in life. But I started out with an accounting degree and very quickly realised that wasn't for me, in the sense that a lot of the training for accountancy to start with, I know that's not the case later in the career, and not what every accountant would do, is largely about the past. What have you done? What's happened? And for me, financial planning and the aspiration to pursue that as a direction was all about what can we do to improve the future rather than accounting for the past.
And whereabouts was that, Tim? Where are you from?
So Sydney born and bred. Grew up in the Hills area as a kid, and that was a great place to grow up, and had a great environment to do that. But my path was a little bit unusual in the sense that I didn't take the usual sort of career trajectory. Instead, I got married. I was very fortunate to find my soulmate early on in life, and that sort of, as it does, it tends to style the sort of things you do. So, you know, I remember sitting down with my wife at the time and going, you know what, I could probably just be as happy as an architect or an engineer or a financial planner. So I remember actually making an intentional decision to pursue that trajectory. And back in the day, I think I started out with, it's called Integratech. They became Tribeca and then became what we know as Kaplan today. And so studying the industry outside of the industry was really challenging doing that independently.
So just on that, you were working as an accountant, or you just finished your accounting quals and you decided just to jump into financial planning? What year was that, Tim?
Completely different career. So I think it was the year 2000, around 2000, 2001. So that I sort of made that intentional decision. And I remember, you know, lining up for every job application as I was studying. I was looking for a different direction to take. In fact, I had a big, thick file of about 140 job applicants I was using through recruiting processes and just getting nowhere. So back in those days, I actually looked up the FPA website. I found businesses in the area that was appropriate to work in, and I actually just literally went door knocking and said, "Hey, look, I'm not ready now, but you might be ready and I might be ready at some stage in the future." So I found that really direct relational approach was far more effective in striking and creating those opportunities back very early days.
And so you completed Kaplan. What was it back then? Was it the diploma of financial planning?
Yeah, the diploma, which I think is now like the advanced diploma because it was 8 modules. That was the sort of the full thing. And so I started working in a practice. And I literally was the guy who emptied the bins, made the coffees, did the funds research that now we have 400 people do. I was the guy that was ringing the cold list of clients that no one had spoken to for 3 or 5 years, on behalf of the advisor. And then I worked my way up to associate and so forth. So I sort of had that great experience of going in at the ground level in financial services. And I think I look back at that. And as much as it was sort of a hard slog to get through, I think that's really given me a great understanding and appreciation of what the financial industries is at the ground level, and also the things that we ask our team members to do in supporting businesses.
And knowing you now, it's also moulded the fact that you're very keen on the best, highest use, and probably very early on, as much as emptying rubbish bins and calling and sitting on hold to product providers was fun, it's probably not something you saw yourself doing for the rest of your life.
No, but look, I look back at that time and I go, ringing those clients and trying to get engagement was a great life experience to build resilience and also sales and relationship building, because I knew that if I got through 9 no's, I'd be just as grateful for the no because I knew I got a little bit closer to the yes, someone who's happy to engage. So, and I think that's the approach I still take now, 20 years later. Go, okay, well, got a no now, but I'm one step closer to getting the right outcome.
It sounds like the sort of comment also that's made by a father. So you've got a couple of kids, Tim?
Yes, I've got a 12-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I think they teach you just as much as you learn in work. So it's great them seeing going through that high school experience now as well. But there's some couple of things I suppose you learn as being a father. In the same way, when you get married, that tends to shift your priorities. So too does being a dad, and they're all good things.
Absolutely. So after you've started in your financial planning and you moved to associate advisor, which by the way is now an actual role, but then it was more of a vibe. Whereabouts was that, and how long did you do that for?
Yeah, so I was working with an A&P aligned practice in Liverpool, actually, originally, because when we married, that's where we relocated at the time. It was a practice that was close nearby. And in fact, I remember being tasked with this thing called paraplanning that we have today, when paraplanning didn't even exist.
Well, back then it was for planners in Parramatta, to be brutally honest.
So I remember sitting down with and sort of being tasked with, well, look, how do you make this roll? How do you make it work? What do you do when there was no guidance or technical support or even a thing called paraplanning? And so that really was the requirement to move to an advisor back then, and then build someone behind me to take over what had been created in that capability. So I worked there for a number of years. Long story short, there was a bit of a succession plan that didn't work out particularly as where everyone would have expected.
That's very rare out there in financial planning, Tim. No one ever says that on the podcast.
No. But that was a great catalyst because I remember speaking about being a father. We just had our first child, Chloe, my daughter, and I went to my wife and said, "Look, hon, is it okay if you feel I step out on my own?" Perfect timing. And to her credit, she said, "Yeah, why not? Absolutely. This makes you happy, and I can support you in doing that." And that's exactly what I did. So at that point, I had an introduction. I was fortunate enough to go and sort of, build a capability alongside another planner, Michael Langtree, over towards Hurstville at that time, and then later Sutherland. And that was a great time as well, and learnt a lot of things along the way. I think all of us, Roxy and I have talked about this as well in various meetings. If all of us reflect on our experiences to date, and you asked, would you do it the same way? I think we'd say a resounding.
Well, I think I haven't got a choice, have you? You say, yeah.
No.
Potentially you might learn from life's lessons, and I think that's the difference between wisdom and knowledge, really, isn't it?
Absolutely.
If you're out there and you're listening to this and you're in your 20s, I would be latching on to someone who's 65, who's got 40 years experience, and just asking about their wisdom.
Absolutely.
It's nuggets of gold, guys.
But that's what styles, I suppose, our current conversations that Rox and I might have in various businesses that we're involved with, because we go, look, how do we accelerate that growth rate from those very early days, and how do we support businesses to approach it in a different way that gets scalable outcomes for everyone?
And what kind of a financial planner do you think you were when you were giving advice?
Oh, I thought I was pretty good. That's what you mean. But
maybe elaborate on that. Maybe a bit more around that, please.
Yeah, sure. So when I looked at financial services, there was a couple of things. I saw that most businesses that wanted to be everything to everyone really struggled, particularly when they didn't have scale. So very early on, I at least had concluded that I needed to focus my attention on specific areas. So for that reason, I largely focused on corporate superannuation, working with ASX listed businesses, etc. To create appropriate employment plans through corporate superannuation. And look, whilst that model's been largely abolished, in many respects, it was the greatest way for people to access affordable financial advice that was funded through those group arrangements. So I'd go in and I'd do basically speed dating with 20 clients for a day, run the education seminars, which a number of people in the corporate space would do for a period of time. But the other thing I also came to realize early on is, and this maybe goes back to the accounting aspect and my passion for business, but I concluded that for business owners, the way to improve their financial position, many of the strategies that are applicable for pay-as-you-go or personal financial planning just doesn't have the same degree of impact for those that are in business. Those who own businesses, the best way to improve their personal wealth was, in fact, to drive the performance of the business, which both increased the profitability and also the valuation to them. So for that reason, I went down a very unusual path. I think at the time I was only one of 6 advisors in that particular network that were formally accredited for business advice, specifically across all of Australia. And then my focus largely became on business advisory, running, conducting valuations, and working then in a sort of a chairman capacity to bring the right people into these businesses to help drive for the goal of driving their personal outcomes. So after a period of time, and sort of how I did that for a number of years, I then realised that that I should look and focus on the business aspect of it. I made a decisive decision to do a few things differently.
And just before we move on to sort of your pivot, you mentioned about the employee super and that education and that sort of gateway. You're not the last person who's mentioned that. In fact, a few guests in the last month have mentioned that, and it kind of was an unintended consequence of regulation. But there are now definitely companies that are in there filling that void. And in fact, one of the co-founders of XY, Ray Jarmus, he's working with a company called Employment Hero, and it's just gone from strength to strength. So there's a real demand for that. And I think that's something that advisors will potentially get back into, although it might be in a different way, because it's a advice on scale that potentially Australia needs.
Absolutely, and back to that point of it's really about financial literacy. If I look at financial planning, ultimately it's about clarifying goals, but also you want to increase the literacy of the clients you're working with. So those sorts of schemes provided through employment relationships, I believe that the validity of those services is just as relevant as what it was 15 years ago today. And businesses who are actively looking to engage their people and culture to drive team engagement should definitely be exploring means in which they can provide financial literacy programs as part of that experience through those different models and some of those avenues you mentioned.
So you're there, you're a frustrated business advisor, you've been a frustrated accountant, you're from a family of accountants, so you figured that you're the funniest one in the family, so you'll maybe branch out into financial planning. I don't know how that ended up. I'm yet to be concluded. But and you're building this business advice. What did you do next?
So I had a significant moment, I suppose. So I found myself in a situation where, a lot of people probably listening to this have experienced it as well, where you sort of have life sort of wakes you up and says, hey, look, you just need to reevaluate things. So I had a moment where I actually found myself having a cardiac event, only in my 30s. And where I found myself, sitting in a cardiac ward with a number of different 60-year-olds who've had major sort of issues. And it was purely just out of the way I was running things, the demands I put myself under, the pressures I had. And perhaps I hadn't got that balance right between business and personal. And so at that moment, I made the decision that I needed to make a key change. So at that point, I then moved forward to sell the financial planning aspect of what I was doing and really focus on the business consultancy and business advisory at that particular point. Now, what that had meant is I was, like Rox had mentioned, I was one of the early adopters of Virtual Business Partners services. That was largely because, at the time, and we still talk about this issue of cost to serve, one of the greatest areas of expense is around labour efficiency for a business. So if you can leverage the economic arbitrage that's available through building global teams, then that is a really tangible way, if you get that right, to increase the profitability of the business. So for me, that meant that that was my sort of introduction to Virtual Business Partners and David Carney at the time. He came and spoke to a professional development conference. I liked what the style of person he was and what he had to say. And I think I was patient number 8 in the zombie apocalypse, where Rox, you're a little bit earlier than that.
and what did you have your so early days when you were looking effectively to leverage your time, and the way in which you speak about it now is very much a seasoned veteran looking at the whole thing. What kind of tasks did you get them to do? What did you not want to do again?
Yeah, so I concluded that being in business, the challenge is if you're both an advisor and trying to operate a business, it really limits your ability to scale because the business is relying on you for revenue, and that competes with the various responsibilities you have in business itself and the ability to scale. So, what I was looking to do is create an environment where I no longer was the authorized representative. I no longer was actually client facing, but instead focused on building teams of people who did that instead. Now, one of the interesting things that happened at the time, which really styled my decision to move out of FP, is my licensee actually wouldn't allow me to make that transition. So in other words, for me to maintain my CAR and my AR, they demanded and insisted that I actually maintain my authorised rep status at that time, which actually hamstrung my ability to build a platform for advisors and to build a business at that point. So having signed a master services agreement 10 years earlier, having these sorts of caveats and restrictions that meant I was pursuing a path that was no longer aligned to the licensee, so combined with the health issue I had at that particular time, sort of brought everything to a head and go, you know what, I know I've built all the systems to enable scale, but at this point, I'm not going to be able to go forward at this point.
Oh, look, we normally get people to say a shout out to the companies that they're talking about. We probably leave that one alone, Tim. Leave that one to an imagination.
Oh, look, it's not negative, but in this sense, there's great people in all those businesses. I look fondly back at all the relationships I had. Many of those people, unfortunately, have passed, but who are pioneers in those businesses, despite their negative public reputation. Businesses are made up of people, and there's some really good people that I'd attribute my learnings and experiences along the way. It was just the set of rules that they had at the time and the playbook they had.
And what I was hoping to do now is just change gears. And look, a big excitement for the reason that I wanted to talk to you today is just the unusual position you've found yourself running what possibly is the largest by headcount financial services business in Australia, and just getting some key observations. The business that you're in, that I'm very familiar with, maybe give us a bit of a feel for what it is.
Yep.
And from a financial planning perspective, and you're kind of like the keeper of all secrets. You're across all licensees, you're across all tech. So maybe once you've done that, I'd really like to pick your brains, and we may even get to a stage where I hit you up and say, who does it best? What piece of tech?
Okay, right.
I'm giving you a few minutes to percolate on that. So maybe give us a bit of a platform of what you're doing now.
Yep.
And then I'd like to ask some questions about your observations.
Yeah, great. So how I made the transition from making an unfortunate, what I felt was a really unfortunate decision to exit, because there was no other option at this stage. I couldn't transfer licensee because of their view of who owned clients, etc. I just pursued the business consulting. At that point, Virtual Business Partners had some dealings with me. They knew of who I was, and they had asked me to come and drive building paraplanning capability within the business, initially as a consultant, and specifically. So I went into that business with the express intention of scaling and creating a scalable advice delivery business in paraplanning. When I looked around at the market at the time, the models that were typically used around pay-per-use and licensee specialisation, I couldn't find any examples where that actually scale on any significant level. So the nut I really wanted to crack is, like, how do we serve and provide exceptional advice as we look at financial planning? a lot of the constraint, even though we're losing financial planners at a fairly alarming rate, the main sort of sticking point for much advice production is the generation of the documents themselves. So, even in the paraplanning function, that as a resource is quite limited to obtain the right skill sets at an appropriate cost that makes that appropriate. Now, in the role that I have, we don't ever seek to replace paraplanners that sit in businesses. In fact, we're very much looking to create a career platform for them to move into more leadership of the teams we put in place rather than replacement of. And as Roxy would attest, I've heard you say before, spending EBIT becomes pretty addictive, right? So, so if we're driving that for businesses, then they're only going to invest more in Australian resources and teams, as we've done ourselves, and I might touch on that a little bit later. Around that. So I came into Virtual Business Partners, and I was really thrilled that through the team, of course, it's not my own individual efforts, we were able to go from 0 to 100 paraplanners in the space of 12 months.
Wow. And was there any particular AFSL that you worked with, or maybe give us an idea of the early days?
Yeah, so the early days were pretty hands-on. It included me sitting alongside paraplanners, looking at their strategies and the documents they were given. And to their credit, you hire the right people, you train them and provide the right tools and support. It's incredible what people can provide. And particularly in this case where we created a large core group, you bring any new person into that environment, the speed of learning and the culture that's created is just electric, absolutely electric. So in the early days, the business that in Virtual Business Partners was largely AMP focused as a legacy of where business activity had started. And also, as anyone in the industry would know, AMP's usually been slapped around with enforceable undertakings and the like, which means they've had to get very, very clear and explicit about their policy. Now, I'm not going to go into what opinions people might have around those policies, but what it means is AMP had to be very concise about the standards and the advice standards. And we knew if we built them to those requirements, we could satisfy a number of licensees. Bearing in mind that one of the key goals for the paraplanning function was to create a licensee agnostic offering. And again, part of that scalable issue was there might have been an RI advice paraplanning capability. There might have been, some other licensee. But how do you actually create a genuinely agnostic capability? And the answer to that was really around, well, they're all playing by the same rule book, but it's just their interpretation of those policies will differ. So as long as we, typically you think about, if you do all things to all people, you become the master of none, right? But our mastery was around how do we be masters at understanding those variables, creating that one source of truth between us and clients and licensees, and then focus all the training, development, quality assurance around that very early, which meant we were able to serve, 15, 20 different licensees, much more now these days, because for those reasons.
And where is the business at today, Tim, the paraplanning business?
Yeah, so the advice business, it's been great to see that grow to around 200. I'm no longer sitting next to paraplanners, helping them with the strategies. We've got my far more capable people who do that every day, which is awesome to see. And I get so much excitement from seeing people who didn't even know what paraplanning was, like I was 20 years ago, be able to perform at exceptional level very quickly and do things that many external parties or viewers wouldn't think is possible at all.
I'm just going to reverse a bit because even when my personal business was at its largest, we had about 40 odd team members. The numbers you're throwing around are quite large, and given we've had 2 years of COVID, and it's very unlikely you've been in the same room as many, if not all, of these people. How do you manage that scale of operation? This is coming from a bloke who had a cardiac event 15 years ago, and we don't intend on that happening again.
No.
So what have you put in place to do that? And how do you, just things like the education, the main thing I wanted to ask about was how do you run a business at scale without dropping dead?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was fortunate the Virtual Business Partners had a great platform in terms of, hiring and recruitment and those things. And so as a business within a business, I suppose, that business now is 850 people. We'll grow at another 300 people this year. And that is quite comfortable in the sense that we want to make sure that advice delivery standards don't drop. And we're quite confident we'll be able to do that. In terms of what makes the difference, well, I think, when I looked back at those experiences, it was largely based on pressures and stress that I placed on myself. I had actually nothing actually physically wrong with me. It was purely my state, my ability to balance load, and also realize that a lot of the deadlines I had in my mind were often ones that were self-imposed. So in a lot of cases, I just had to let them go, be better at prioritizing. But in terms of how we make that work, there's a couple of pieces or pillars that are absolutely vital. The first one is the right cadence. So, every business struggles with this, whether you're 40, as you mentioned, Rox, even 5, 12, and that just gets compounded on those sorts of numbers that we're talking about. So you really have to double down on cadence of communication.
Just to be specific, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so these are very, very clear meeting rhythms in the business. So and there's two elements to cadence, and one of those is operational cadence. So what's happening in the business, what decisions need to be made, how do you get a decision maker, and how do you get information up and down the sort of the organizational chart, if you like, very quickly. So one of the practices that has been an absolute pillar is the routine of daily huddle. In our business, we have that at every level of our organization, so that issues from the frontline teams get all the way to executive level if needed, but the intent is to solve them at each level along the way. That's operational cadence. More recently, we've been really focused on performance cadence. So, okay, that's what's not working, what's needed, what's broken, what needs to be fixed. But also the performance cadence is all about who needs help. Are people meeting the goals? And in an organization that size, you need to be very clear as to what the goals are. They could be company goals, or in our case, it's the client goals. So we know if we align our team members' goals to our client goals, then that'll ultimately provide, the business what it wants. So I've always been very much grounded in values-based advice, and I believe that principle is applicable at any degree of scale. So in other words, if we can drive meaningful value for our clients first, and that's our focus, we know what we'll get out of it along the way if we do a reasonable job of it. So they would be the two of the key pillars. The last one is that goal setting. And the business outcome goals are really easy. So as an advisor, you might have 4 appointments a week, 2 fact finds, 3 plans, but they're all outcomes. What I'm talking about specifically, which is a lot harder to define, is those development goals. What is it the person needs in order to hit the outcomes that are important for the business? And that's a skill set that most leaders don't have. And I'm sure many people would attest that even though they might be in leadership roles themselves, and I sat in a room with some very senior executives across a number of industries just recently, there was no really formal pathway to becoming a leader. So, how can we create, so what that creates is one problem. People aren't great at actually focusing on development goals. And secondly, how can we actually deliver a program that creates leaders and builds people to become the very best possible versions of themselves?
And given that predominantly the financial planning industry, the mortgage broking industry, is a small to medium-sized business, what do you see, and here I'm getting into the picking of your brain, and what do you see people doing really well at that level, and what do you see just common things that they do poorly that you just pull your hair out because it's so easily fixed?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what is happening in the industry is governed by regulation. And this is a topic that's been talked about for a very long time. But, I feel that my position on regulation is only helpful if it actually helps people get access to financial advice. So that really should be the litmus test as to whether regulation has been successful or not. And I generally feel that as an industry, and that's evident by the number of changes of ownership and direction, as to we haven't quite got that right yet. But I feel that if we just applied that brush and that test to those regulations, we'd probably end up at a point that actually achieves the right outcomes and makes financial advice more accessible to more Australians in some of the ways we talked about similarly. So that would be the first point.
And what about the things that you observe in day-to-day practices that you just wish you could have a time machine and take people back 10 years and fix it?
Yeah, well, I guess what's great about what we do as a fairly broad church is we get to solve problems for a range of different situations, remediation, look back, some fairly challenging situations. But having solved that for one business and driving that as a project means we can take that to other other businesses and say, hey, you know what? You're not alone. That's the hardest thing. I think you go, look, I'm struggling with this. I go, you know what? You're not the only one. You're not the first problem. You're not the last person who'll struggle with these things. But those who are doing really well, they focus on building their people rather than being very good practitioners themselves. So I think as soon as you make that mental shift in business ownership to go, look, I'm going to create an environment for people to deliver advice, then that affects every other aspect of a decision making you make. So those who are doing well invest in their people. They realize that they are really the engine to getting the right outcomes, and make sure that the client experience is very, very clear.
And typically, what kind of scale are those businesses, Tim? Are they 100-person businesses? Do they wait till 10? Or where do you see that kicks in?
Yeah, so I think that attitude can start from a very early point. But I think you
run out of money, Tim.
You do, yeah. You're either it's money, time, or people, right? So I think that can happen. That happens soon as you get a practice manager or someone who's actually focused on something that's not operations itself.
And let's define what your interpretation of practice manager is, or general manager, because from our previous discussions, you're very firm on this. This is the turning point in a business, going from being a business that works you to a business that you sort of you own and manage. So, what do you define as a practice manager, and what roles do they have, and what part do they play in a progressive scaling up financial planning business?
Yeah, excellent. Great question, Roxy. So I think all of us would easily agree to the concepts of a front office. It's your front of house that's seeing clients, that's engaging in advice delivery, and also back office, which we've touched on before. It's your administration support. It's your para planning function. But the key role key capability we're talking about is in fact a middle office. So in that middle office is really themes of the right technology stack. It's going to hover around what's our employee experience? What's our team engagement? Do we have people who are actually motivated to grow within the business and grow the business as a result of that? It's around issues of systems and workflows. So how do we create operational excellence in that business? And the challenge though for those practice managers is often they would look around the business and go, you know what, everyone's got a job. I can't drive these improvement projects because I just don't have the resources internally. And that's where some of the solutions that we have in Virtual Business Partners might be relevant to solve that. But in solving that challenge. But yeah, it's really that middle office function that's focused on people, technology, culture, in driving businesses, rather than, what we'd often see is client service managers who are just given the title of practice manager, but haven't been actually set up for success in that role.
Well, I think that's really important because you're right. It's every other business that's out there, including almost all of our businesses that our successful clients have. The most important people in the business are the general managers, the connectors, logistics, the people managers. And in financial services, quite often, as you say, it is the role of the head of the operations team or the head of the admin team to step into that. But I just see a real failing in all of the education streams, all of the development streams in our industry. And just what I mean by that, there's plenty of CPD points for advisors. There's plenty for paraplanners. Life insurance companies will run great courses for people in the back office and operations. But there's just that kind of general manager who effectively is running the business of the business. There seems to be a void there. And yet you've just rated it as the most important person in the business. So where do you see the industry fixing this?
Yeah, 100%. So I think at an early stage, you're going to have a capacity wall. So you're going to run into, I just don't have enough capacity to deliver. But the next sort of challenge or barrier to break is one around complexity. And so that complexity, so the way people tend to solve this, Rox, to answer your question more specifically, is we're seeing a great deal of mergers and acquisitions across our industry of people that rise to that middle tier of advice business as a means to solve that or to gain access to talent in this middle office capability.
And is that being led by licensees? Is it being led by private equity? Is it just being led by the realisation that that profit can only come through scale? What do you see is leading that consolidation?
I think it's all of those things. But to be more specific, we've got licensees withdrawing from their traditional business models. And also moving, which I think in many cases is great for the industry, is to be capital enablers through the provision of equity, to allow those who are good operators across their network to achieve that consolidation. So I think that's definitely one part of it. The second part of it is, I don't think, you and I, if we went back to we tried to start again as a single advisor, it'd be incredibly challenging compared to what it was 15, 20 years ago. So I think that's secondly is part of it. It's just the complexity of it. And then thirdly, I go, maybe you can start, but can you scale profitably? And as you said, stay sane along the way. And I'm not sure the answer to that is a resounding yes.
Well, I'm not sure financial planners start sane based on my friends in the industry. But no, you're correct. And you mentioned before things, you touched on tech stack, employee experience, workflows, operational excellence. Given that you're across literally hundreds of practices, now's your chance. What do you see? And you don't have to name the names because I know that you're involved in everyone. But what do you see when a tech stack works? And what do you see are the common problems when people put together a tech stack? And feel free to shout out or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we're fortunate to have worked for the licensee as well of the practice. So we have been the delivery engine in licensees. And it's up some of the mid-tier licensees, we are the licensee in terms of the services we provide. So I think in terms of tech stack, I think the common pitfall that most people run into is they look for the technology to solve the problem. But often the technology stack is often a black box. It's something that has to be crafted around your workflows. So instead, let's start at the right place and go, look, what is it we're trying to achieve? And specifically, there's 3 problem statements that are very clear across the industry. I mean, there's lots of problems if you read much of the publications, and hence why I'm so aligned to the XY Advisor value proposition, which is all about positive change of advice. I completely agree with that. We need to be talking more about it. There needs to be more noise about its opportunity. So when we come to the 3 problem statements, the first one is about sales cycle. So how long does it take to engage a client through to actually providing advice? And in many cases, when we did some research around this, the larger businesses, their sales cycle increased. So larger businesses increase the amount of time it delivers advice compared to smaller advice businesses. So that was a really interesting insight, which led us to, fully understand that that's that complexity wall. And that's to do with the fact you've got more people involved in the file. So if you're a follower of lean principles, lean, it doesn't take 30 days to produce a piece of financial advice, as the sales cycle would suggest. It's not 30 days of effort. It's 30 days of time. So where do you target the periods of time where that file is idle? It's about getting waste. And so for financial advice, the wastage is idle time when it's sitting idle, not doing anything. And it's also how effective is the handover between each of those roles? Does the next person in the operational chain have everything they need to do to move confidently forward? So that's the first one. Second one is around client experience. And it's obviously related to the sales cycle piece, because if when we're experiencing very challenging global markets, clients that would be a catalyst to reach out for advice. And they go, "Oh, Mr. Advisor, I need to understand, what do I do?" And many advisors have to turn around and say, "Look, it's going to be 30 days, 60 days before I can actually get back to you with a formal position and we can execute." That doesn't create a great client experience. It's not congruent with what they would hope to achieve.
When the sky is falling, it generally doesn't fall progressively over 60 days in a linear fashion.
No, that's right. And look, if an advisor is anything worth their salt, they would have explained to the client, when you feel like throwing a brick through a window, make sure there's a check attached, because that's exactly the point you should be buying it. So if you've done the education piece, that should be less of a problem. But in any case, they will want a timely course correct. So that second one is really around that client experience. How do we improve it? Sales cycle is a big component of it. But also, coming back to your point about technology, how does technology actually support that client experience? What are the touch points the clients are making with your business? When we kicked off a program internally last year, and how we prioritize the things we do is we mapped out the client journey, and we went, right, we're going to start with any point a client touches our business. That's the part we're going to work on first. and look to potentially technology to make that experience more scalable and improve it where possible. So that was the second one. Third one was around the rework. Most advisors would think rework is I get a plan back, I need to change that document. That's not rework for us. Our definition of rework is really around how does that next person in the advice chain have to come back to clarify things they've received throughout the file. And the other thing is how complete is that information around it. So 3 problem statements to recap. First is sales cycle. How do you solve it? Obviously, if you reduce the sales cycle, you improve the cash flow of the business. Secondly, you'll also improve the client experience, and how do you target that specifically? And then thirdly, it's around rework. How do you create a really effective handover? And I think, that's something you wrestle with as you scale. So how do you remove complexity, and how do you leverage technology that actually supports it?
Yeah, that all sounds really, really good. But yet again, we're sitting here in one room, and all of the people who work for you are all around the world. How do you know that they're doing the things that you want them to do? Like, what's the oversight?
Yep. So the first part is definitely that cadence. So that's, you got to know what's happening. But the second part is, what data do you have to support it? So, for me, I really much leverage and lean on data for any decision making. It's probably part of my bias as some of our occupations.
Frustrated engineer.
So we use things like a time camp as one specific example. There's lots of other technologies around there, but it does autonomous tracking of what users are working with, and also a structured tracking around projects. So a project in the context of a financial planning practice might be the client file or the piece of business you're working on. But we use those insights in a whole range of different ways. So, for example, for our teams, we can see what the mix is between different technology across their tech stack. So, as an example of that, if we're seeing a paraplanner and they're spending like a day a week in email, well, they're not having a client-facing role. So why are they in the email? So that will tend to tell us that the individual doesn't have a task management system. They're having to spend a lot of time doing rework clarification, most likely via email. And that sort of allows us to troubleshoot. Now, the really cool thing that can happen is if we've got in many cases, our team members might be 30% of the headcount for a business, in a partially optimized business. So it's very likely that what the team is experiencing that we have data around is also the experience for the rest of the Australian team.
It's the iceberg, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, that data and those insights are incredibly useful to understand, is the tech stack that the business has got, is it effective? Has the role themselves been set up for success? And it's very likely that the data we're able to provide is a good insight into what's happening across the broader business as well. So we have discussions around those topics fairly regularly.
And so you surely have managed to dodge which particular piece of technology you feel works best.
Well, it's a bit like I get asked that question quite a lot. Is it Xplan? Is it Salesforce? And I go, look, largely I think there's some really interesting emerging technologies which I'd be very, very keen in supporting. But I think, largely, at the risk of probably offending everyone, it can be a bit like, what's the best bank? I go, well, they're all banks, aren't they? So if for me as an advisor, even if I look back at my early experience, if I had logged into Xplan as a principal, it was a bad day. Right? Doesn't matter if Xplan or whatever technology, but at any point I'm now then on the tools is not the highest and best use of my time. So if you're still having advisors who are doing model portfolios or fund comparisons or research or delving into Xplan for anything else that's not file notes, where their highest best use is seeing clients, solving problems, securing revenue, well, then there's an opportunity to optimize your business and consider whether building a global team is an appropriate means to achieve it.
And I kind of know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it because it's hilarious. Given that Time Camp, as you've mentioned, can actually show us how many seconds tasks take, there is an internal capability for that. But one of the fun things is it actually highlights which companies put our people on hold the longest.
Yeah, that's right.
So we're these are companies quite often that we're giving investment dollars to or insurance dollars to. And in relation to that, is there anything, and this is a great forum and you could end up being a hero out of this, is there any advice you could give to the product providers who are providing the platforms, the funds, the insurances, etc., on how they engage with their advice practices? Because and just how wildly different the experiences can be. So maybe touch on that, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, TimeCamp is just one example. There's lots of other productivity tools. Some of the other data that's really useful is team engagement, and there's a whole range of pieces around that if you wanted to explore on that today. But when it comes to the approach that providers are taking, I think we have to go back to and say, look, how do we solve the problems for the customer? How do we get more people access to high quality advice that achieves the right outcome? What can they do better? And specifically in those areas we've spoken about. So in what way a provider can help with sales cycle? Well, if we're seeing a trend where they're consuming so much time on the phone to get data and insights for part of the advice process, well, there's one meaningful, tangible way that providers can work towards in having a meaningful impact on that the productivity of a particular practice. What investment can those providers make into some of those areas I've spoken about? Can they lean in with technology? Can they lean in with training and development as well? Or, make sure we've got the right mix of support. As we've seen margins squeezed on licensees and product providers, a lot of the great people that would often be interacting with your business to talk about these things, even just to be a sounding board, have actually been removed. Your PDMs, your BDMs, and those sorts of things. So how is it that these providers who do have the benefit of scale, work alongside these businesses in some of these areas?
And it's just frustrating that companies that are open for business and wanting the financial planning industry to support them still are running a half an hour average wait time to be spoken to.
Yeah,
it's a real paradox.
Yeah, and it's just data, so there's got to be better ways to gain access to it. So I think, let's agree on a common set of problem statements, and it'd be great for the participants in the industry to focus on them specifically, and then turn to very pragmatic solutions for things that are within our control, because there's no point shouting at the wind about regulations, expecting change. Whilst that's important to be proactive and lobby, the reality is that any one individual business is not going to be able to make significant change. So to your point earlier, you asked questions about who are being successful. I can tell you unequivocally that those see the current market environments as an opportunity rather than a threat are the ones that will come out the winners.
And let's just talk more about the business of the scale of the business as far as so many people. When we're talking about people and culture, what tools do you recommend, or what tools are you using to help run that are actually working? Because there's a lot of ones out there that say they can do things, and there's people out there who will pay their SaaS contracts and whatnot, but have you got some firm opinions around what does work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we implement in our business a particular technology called Culture Amp. There's a number of different solutions available, but the key point is having a technology that's actually all about gaining insights about how your people are feeling, the general health of the business. The second part is a structured means to do performance reviews. And there's just as much ambiguity about what a performance review is, just as there is around, the position descriptions of practice managers and paraplanners. Like, what's the scope of those roles? So, clear scope, clear goals, clear performance structure. And even in our recent times, we had to circle back and go, what we'd set up originally or previously, it wasn't really focused on the human as an individual. So we intentionally moved away things that included scores or quantitative metrics, and really focused and doubled down on goals. So, do you have a platform that provides cascading goals, that provides that line of sight? So the thing I do as a paraplanner or a financial planner or a financial planning assistant, I know directly in what way that moves the result for the client, and I know it removes the result for the business. Everyone wants to know they're in a job for purpose, right? So if you can provide that line of sight, around those sorts of issues, then technology such as Culture Amp provides some really useful tools. But again, it's how you use it. What's the purpose of it? Just buying another piece of technology and expecting to solve your people problem is not it. You've got to have a genuine buy-in and commitment from everyone but use these as meaningful insights for data and direction as to where to focus first.
And I think you nailed it there. The people need a purpose. There's a lot of conversation around it. It's a tight labour market in financial advice. It's hard to get people working for you. We've got the great net resignation either happening or about to happen. And I totally agree. I think that people who work for you, regardless of what role they have, all want to know what their effort for that day has done and how it's helped the client and how they've derived utility from it. So making that connection is critical.
Yeah, particularly for A players. So if you're looking to have A players in your business, they will want to know how they're performing. They will want to have structure around what they should be doing and whether they're hitting the mark. So if you've got those people in your business, you're just going to frustrate them without having that structure and purpose in place, and you'll lose them to someone else who is prepared to invest in those areas.
Yeah, correct. So right now, what's today hold? I'm very interested to know where are you at the present day? How do you run your day, and where do you see the future of financial advice practices? And I want you to be quite detailed here because
big question.
You're across a few of them. So yeah, how do you operate your current day, and where do you see the future of practices?
Yep. So my current present focus is really supporting the team. My version of leadership is one of where I'm there to serve. So whilst I might have an executive title, an executive role, and obviously the decision-making that comes with that, my function, my highest and best use is saying, how do I enable my team and my people to really be successful in what they're doing? And so that's largely part of my focus. In terms of my rhythms, it would consist of having that cadence of the morning, having that opportunity where issues from the frontline teams would cascade up to decision making if needed, and that information gets back down as quickly as possible.
And how many levels are we talking here, Tim?
Probably about 4. So there'd be at least 4, if not 5 levels of leadership to communicate through. Now, there's a lot more we can do better, and we focus on that every day. So I just want to use this opportunity to give a couple of shout outs to some of our team members. We've got some incredible people across in the Philippines as our senior leadership team who drive that business, who have overcome incredible adversity and tested our BCP to its fullest extent in recent times with the combination of COVID and the typhoon. And also shout out to our incredible Australian leadership team, which has expanded recently across roles of relationship management, quality assurance, and client services support. So we can actually, put people and drop people into business improvement projects along our clients, our practices that we work with, or the corporate clients that we have, who can make incredible tangible means leveraging their 10, 15 years experience at the cold face of business improvement with those clients.
And with all of that in place, the only missing piece for going forward is your definition of a perfect client. Now, I know that's sort of might be a bit of a stretch, but what traits do you see of the people that are coming in to engage across multiple parts of your business that are leading indicators of future success?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's really about, do we have alignment? So does the business generally have the same values that I've expressed today in terms of their people, in terms of solving problems, being prepared to invest in those problems. And also there's a degree of vulnerability I think that's needed in any genuine partnership where you go, you know what, we haven't got this right. And both parties need to be able to say that at a time as you wrestle with these different challenges. And then a very clear open commitment to rally around them in different ways. People, the business of people is messy, and everyone's in the business of people. So, I
love that comment because sometimes I think we like to overplan things, but Mike Tyson used to say, and I'll probably get this wrong, but everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I feel like that's how financial planners work. They get up in the morning, they get going, and then there's an email or a phone call and they've just been punched in the face.
Yeah, and that's a great way of describing. If you follow Covey at all, he would talk about the whirlwind versus the strategic or your wildly important goals. And I think, a business has to be intentional about pursuing strategic improvement and deliberately putting aside the whirlwind distractions for both themselves as senior leaders in the business, but also creating that same structure and rigor for their teams as well. So, our ideal client, someone who's going to benefit from this the most, is where you've got some degree of middle office in place. You've got some degree of practice management or general management in a practice business specifically. You have realized there is both a capacity and a complexity challenge in the business. You've probably leveraged or tried a number of different avenues. Maybe you spent a fortune on technology at some point, only just to realize, you know what? It's just a box, right? So for us, we're very much people plus technology will get the right results. So how do we help support that people strategy or help you define that people strategy? And then how do we leverage best practice workflows? Because bear in mind, BBP as a business has been in global teams for 8 years. We never had the luxury of being in an office together. So as the world has had to come to grips with how do you do this remote work thing, like that's what we've had to lead with and craft over a number of years as we built this capability for the clients across paraplanning and the financial planning administration services and mortgage brokering as well.
And where do you see the financial advice landscape moving in the next couple of years? I think we've had the difficult times, but yeah, I'd be very interested. Where do you see it in 5 years, and where do you see your personal involvement in it?
So I think the core values of financial planning is really around that topic for literacy. Like, how do we provide meaningful financial literacy?
Well, can't they just go on YouTube or TikTok?
Yeah, of course. Maybe what they call it, a finfluencer or influencer. Influencers,
which potentially have their place, but that you need a combination, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely. Yeah. So, it's about scalable advice. So if I look at, say, even like the XY model, it's all about creating the right community, the right forums for connection to occur, even if not in a physical sense. So, how do we create that experience for potential clients in the market? The other element of it is very much around, I think largely we've failed in the public eye to create a profession rather than an industry. So I shared an example of accountancy previously. That's very much seen, rightly or wrongly, as being a profession, one of particular standing.
Why do you think we failed?
Well, I think two parts. I think regulation without that intent I mentioned before, that litmus test. I think we've created legislation that's hindered the ability to reach the right number of people. And I think secondly, we as an industry have not been incredibly consistent or clear as to the value of our advice. I'm sure many advisors, if they spoke to their clients, would go, I wasn't really sure why I came to the door. I knew I needed help, but now I'm here. I just can't believe that I haven't spoken to you sooner. The value you create for us, the security, the clarity is just incredible. So how do we create that again on scale without needing a face-to-face meeting with 45 minutes to build rapport and articulate that value proposition? So, businesses in their own right need to wrestle with that particular challenge. But as an industry, how do we create that really positive articulation of the value that our clients often receive after engagement, but well before that? I think unless we do that, we're not going to see people lining up for financial planning courses. We're not going to see people pursue or be able to articulate and be proud of the fact they're in financial services. I'm incredibly proud of our industry and the profession I've had. I know and I'm confident about the value that I've delivered to clients over those years, and I'm very confident in knowing that our clients deliver that same value to our clients. But how do we create that in the minds of the industry? And in many respects, there's very few professions that get built around at a parliamentary level. There's probably maybe only 2 or 3 that have had that sort of interaction. So how did we get there? How do we take the right ownership? How do we have those right conversations? And how do we create that education as to the market of what we do and also the decision makers? Because in many cases, if we're not making the decisions for the right reasons, we're not going to get the right outcomes. So can we have a clear voice? Can we have a consistent voice would be some of the answers at a higher level, Roxy, that I'd say.
Thanks, Tim. And look, I do speak to you regularly, but I did want to get a bit of an articulation of sort of your thoughts and opinions. It's been a real pleasure today. I know that you probably weren't the keenest to start with to come in, but I thought, well, I'll tease out some insights. And if anyone wants to learn more, there'll be about Tim or what it is that he does. There's links there in the attachments, and they can look him up as well. But Tim, on behalf of XY and the XY podcast and everyone here and all the people listening, I'd like to thank you for your insights and wish you a very good day. Cheers, mate.
Pleasure. Thank you, Rox.